Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Today we have an international edition as Matt is abroad, as they say. Welcome, Matt.
Hello, Tom. I am dialing in from the shores of, I guess it's the St. Lawrence Seaway in Quebec, where the weather here is lovely and cool up in the mountains. We're having a great time.
Matt, we had a fairly propitious few days around cybersecurity issues, first in court and then in the real world. You want to start with Solar Winds and take us through that decision and then what happened starting Friday?
Oh, yeah, there's so much that happened, Tom. And Vladimir Lenin said, there are years when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. And last week for cybersecurity and internal control was one of those weeks when decades happened. And I'm serious. I'll walk everybody through three big things that happened last week. Is number one, on Tuesday, UnitedHealth reported its second quarter earnings, including an update of how much it has cost UnitedHealth for a devastating ransomware attack it suffered in February. Some of you might have experienced that, where its Change Healthcare subsidiary fell victim to a ransomware attack and paralyzed insurance companies' abilities to process payments and approvals. So prescriptions weren't getting filled, surgeries weren't getting done, insurance approvals weren't getting done for weeks on end. That has cost UnitedHealth $853 million at least, and possibly, depending on how you define it, as much as $1 billion in the second quarter alone. And this breach this year will cost UnitedHealth a total of about $2 billion. On a company that is huge, it does probably about $75 to $80 billion of revenue a year, but that is a material amount of money. And one other detail about UnitedHealth is that this happened because one of the servers in Change Healthcare did not implement multi-factor authentication when it should have. And that was the weakness that allowed hackers to take it over. Everything ensues. That was Tuesday. And then on Thursday, a federal district judge in New York ruled against the Securities and Exchange Commission in its lawsuit against SolarWinds and its CISO, Timothy Brown, for the cybersecurity attack that SolarWinds had suffered in 2020, where Russian agents infiltrated SolarWinds, polluted its software for managing your IT systems, infected a software update that then went out to hundreds and hundreds, if not at least 1,000 or 2,000 corporate customers with infected software, including into government agencies. Everybody was reading everybody's emails and all this sensitive stuff. Disaster that fell SolarWinds, and last fall, the SEC sued SolarWinds and its CISO, Timothy Brown, on two grounds. Number one, they had not accurately disclosed SolarWinds' cybersecurity practices, which they said were great, but clearly were terrible because they fell victim to all of this mess. And the SEC had filed suit saying you had improper accounting controls when you should have had effective accounting controls would have governed access to key systems, such as the IT systems. And that didn't happen because the hackers got in. And the SEC was using internal accounting control provisions of the Exchange Act to enforce against cybersecurity. And the federal judge last week ruled that no, SEC, you can't use that. This is internal accounting controls are for accounting, and we all know what that means. It's money, it's transactions, it's books, it's records. It's not cybersecurity, and the law doesn't say effective cybersecurity controls. It says effective internal accounting controls. If we want to apply it to cybersecurity, come up with a law or a rule that says you must have effective internal cybersecurity controls. That's not what the law says. The lawsuit is out. And then on Friday, we had this devastating cybersecurity attack from CrowdStrike, which is a cybersecurity firm that pumped out a defective software update that went out to improve the security of Windows operating systems that thousands of banks, corporations, airlines, hospitals around the world that they use, except the software update was flawed. This was not an attack. This was just a screw up on CrowdStrike's part, but they pumped out a flawed update, which derailed the Microsoft Windows systems many corporations use. Chaos ensues. I personally could not check my bank balances at two of my banks for at least 8 or 9 hours. That morning, I happened to be talking to the chief compliance officer of one of the largest restaurant chains in the United States. Most of us have eaten there before. They had been knocked offline nationwide for most of the overnight, Friday into Friday morning. By noon Friday, at least the East Coast was up for lunch, but this chief compliance officer looked like they hadn't slept in hours and hours, probably because they've been up since 1 in the morning. And Tom, this all ties back because in theory, a regulator could sanction CrowdStrike for having ineffective cybersecurity controls of some kind, except we don't have a regulation for that. CrowdStrike is a publicly traded company, so in theory, the SEC could have tried to enforce under the effective accounting controls because access controls are access controls. Whether you're accessing money or data or systems, that's what the SEC said. It doesn't matter. Effective controls is effective controls, and we're going to sue you if you fail. But a judge had just said, no, SEC, you can't do that. So this is the problem that I'm getting at here is that we had two major cybersecurity incidents. One was the CrowdStrike disaster. One was UnitedHealth's update. And in the middle of that, we had a judge that just said the SEC can't enforce against this. And we have no other regulator, I believe, who effectively can. But we have a clear, present, widespread, severe risk to corporate performance, consumer daily life, potentially national security, and we don't have a regulatory mechanism to tell companies to do better at solving it.
The suit against Solar Winds, I'd like to focus just for a moment on the part the judge left in,
Sure.
Matt, because I thought his quote, or at least his language that you quoted in your blog post, was pretty damning because he said basically the misrepresentations by Solar Wind were, quote, undeniably material, end quote. So that's the federal judge in who the case is in front of. And I think that Solar Winds and Timothy Brown may have a day of reckoning based on that.
They may, and they are not out of the woods by any stretch, but they're out of at least half of the woods because there were two prongs of the SEC lawsuit. There was the internal controls case dismissed, or that level of that part of the case that was dismissed, but they do still have the misleading disclosures. What happened there was that the Solar Winds and Timothy Brown at various points in the late 2010s had published several different statements to the investors, to the public, saying our cybersecurity is good. We use multi-factor authentication. We have a strong password policy. We use strong, secure software development. That is an actual term of art, and it means something if you have a secure software development lifecycle. And they had published those statements, and there were internal communications the SEC had obtained where internal people 4 or 5 rungs down the org chart were saying, we don't do any of this. Our password policies are not strong. Our software development is not secure. We are not using multi-factor authentication like we should have. And the complaint generally is that for the company, it was making false statements. It was saying something different to investors when cybersecurity is the lifeblood of what SolarWinds was doing. On the other hand, for the CISO, Mr. Brown in particular, the complaint is that either he knew what the company was saying about cyber was wrong, or he didn't know and he should have because he wasn't paying attention to the scuttlebutt going on underneath him on the org chart. And that part of the case about the disclosures, that is still true. So you're right that he is not out of the woods yet, and SolarWinds is not out of the woods. But as I said, they're out of at least half of the woods. But Tom, two other points here is that for all other companies, this also does provide something of a roadmap to avoid a lot of the woods. You just don't have to say much about what your cybersecurity practices are. You might have to do some boilerplate in the 10Q, but that's fine. Churning out meaningless boilerplate is what lawyers are good at, and they can do that. But what really got SolarWinds into hot water and is still in hot water for is a cybersecurity statement. And that is the official title of the document that SolarWinds had put out, talking about its secure software lifecycle. And that apparently was not actually happening. And so if you're making these other assurances in a statement, in a blog post, in a presentation, and you want to avoid liability for that, don't make them. Still got to put something in the 10K and the 10Q, and you still can. But, there's other ways to still further avoid liability for that. However, let's also take another step back and say that's all the compliance stuff. There is still a lot of operational risk management that, folks, we don't have good cybersecurity in our corporations. And there is still no real strong mechanism to force that for a lot of companies because the SEC's attempt to do so was just defanged by a federal judge. And Tom, I am not entirely clear that there are other regulators who could step in to fill the breach the way it needs to be. Because we still have people not on flights, sleeping in airports. We had people not able to access bank accounts. We had hospital procedures not able to get done here in Boston that happened. What if CrowdStrike's flawed update went into military system? What if the Russians did this instead of it just being an engineering goof, which, to be clear, that's what it was with CrowdStrike and its breach last week. Clearly the Russians know how to do this because they did it with SolarWinds. We have an urgent risk that needs to be addressed, and I'm not sure that we have the regulatory framework to get it addressed. And I don't know that corporations feel the sort of innate risk management impetus that we got to address this double quick, and nobody is.
How do we address it, Matt, at Congress? Can the SEC promulgate new rules or perhaps another agency try something?
Okay, now we get back to what else that Tom, you and I have discussed recently was the Supreme Court and its recent rules against regulatory power. And 2 weeks ago, Tom, you and I talked about how it didn't matter much for corporate compliance programs, and that's still true. But it matters a lot for regulatory agencies, and they're in a real bind now because of the mess that the SEC, that the Supreme Court has created here. So, to answer your question, sure, the SEC could promulgate a new rule that requires effective internal cybersecurity controls, and some right-wing outfit somewhere is going to challenge it immediately, and some right-wing judge appointed by Donald Trump is going to rule it invalid. Back to square one. Maybe the Federal Trade Commission could take some action here, and that's not a bad idea for people who are wondering about that. But the Federal Trade Commission is really a consumer protection agency. And while consumers were ultimately harmed by the CrowdStrike failure, they weren't immediately harmed by the CrowdStrike failure. CrowdStrike doesn't collect a lot of consumer data. It doesn't promise consumers that it's going to keep your data safe. CrowdStrike sells cybersecurity to corporate customers, and it screwed that up. But that's not the same as, say, the UnitedHealth breach, where UnitedHealth did make promises to its customers that, yes, we take your data very seriously, and oops, we just suffered a tremendous breach, and now their personal health data for sale on the dark web. I do think the Federal Trade Commission has some room there, but it has room to punish the offenders. That is not the same as having the regulatory authority to come up with a new rule that says, companies, you got to do better. The SEC does have that authority, except now it'll be challenged in court and probably thrown out by some judge somewhere, thanks to the Supreme Court. The alternative ultimately would be that we need Congress to step in and pass a law, which that's not going to happen because Congress can't agree on what day of the week it is. And B, it would probably need to be fairly exacting in either what the statute requires, or the statute would have to really go through a lot of, say, expressly authorizing an agency to come up with these rules. And that'd still probably be challenged in court. You're still going to have these delays. Like we have time for that. I mean, there are bank accounts that weren't accessed. There were flights that were canceled. There were surgeries that were not accessed. And I just fear for when a nation state actor is going to put the SolarWinds attack and the CrowdStrike attack together, and maybe there are going to be missiles that can't be launched. Maybe there will be satellites thrown out of orbit. Maybe there'll be cell phone systems that don't go down. That is not a far-fetched thing for China or Russia or Iran or North Korea to do. I think most people listening to us, Tom, would say that is a problem. I think most CEOs would say that's bad. We maybe should have some processes in place to not have it happen, except clearly some of the best in the game had this happen. SolarWinds is great at pumping out cybersecurity software. That's their business. They didn't get it right. CrowdStrike does this. They didn't get the code right. So we have a clear need to do it. Short of an act of Congress, I'm not sure that we have the regulatory framework anymore to get it addressed. And I think that, that's troublesome. And that's the thing that I want to call out because CISOs, internal auditors, internal control people everywhere, audit firms, they should be alarmed by what's going on. I think many of them are, but unless somebody gives them a kick in the ass to take a big step forward, I don't know a lot of companies are going to do it.
So, for the compliance professional or the CISO, or perhaps the compliance professional having a cup of coffee with the CISO, can they or should they review what they have in place now and perhaps retrain or somehow get the message to their employees that at least with CrowdStrike, this was human error and that it's human error that causes many of these. And we're going to try to take that out of the equation as much as possible.
If I were counseling anybody, and to be clear, I am not a lawyer, so take it for just me giving my armchair analysis here. But I think that the proper course of action would be to grab your CISO, your head of compliance, and your head of internal audit, and frankly, the CEO and maybe even the chair of the audit committee, because this is going to go that high up. Get all of them together and say, do we have strong, sufficient IT general control? And here's why, is when you look at what happened with CrowdStrike, is that they had a flawed software update that companies implemented without first pausing and inspecting it. That is a weakness in IT general control. And that is not a novel idea in the world of IT general controls. That's like IT GC's 101 is you should inspect an update before you put it in. Now, I'm not talking about us personally. When you look at your phone and you have the little update button and all you do is you press the update. We people, consumers, individuals, we do that all the time. Large corporations, they should not be allowing that. And yet this happened. So as one internal audit executive I know who is, his company was not victim to CrowdStrike, but he did point out that every company that went down, they should have reported in their most recent 10K or in their subsequent 10K that they have a material weakness in their IT general controls, that they don't inspect software packages and software updates before implementing them, because that is how this happened. And it happened to thousands of companies. So it should mean you have an IT general control material weakness. If you're publicly traded, you should have had that disclosed because you already had the weakness, right? Except we all know that you're not going to have that. Nobody is going to have already disclosed that. And that's why the CrowdStrike thing happened. They're going to say, CrowdStrike, we never thought this could be a thing, even though it was a thing 4 years ago when it happened to SolarWinds, and companies should have fixed this by then. And if they fell for this now with CrowdStrike, that means you have a weakness in your IT general controls. And that's the discussion. Compliance, internal audit, CISO, CEO, and the audit committee should be having. Internally, have it first, and then go to your audit committee to say, this is what our problem is, the extent of our exposure, this is how we're going to have that sealed up. I would recommend the internal people have that discussion first and then bring it to the audit committee, just like I said, because if there are any audit committee chairs listening to this podcast, you folks should be calling up the CISO and the head of internal audit right now and asking, is this something that we could fall victim to next time around if you hadn't already? But again, where were the audit firms? Because aren't they auditing IT general controls? That's part of the audit. What are we paying for? Why are they getting clean audit opinion? It's just, Tom, it is astonishing to me that everything can be hunky-dory and all is going along just fine and we're taking cybersecurity seriously. And then this stuff happens, which clearly means we hadn't been taking it seriously enough. But who is the we who's going to address it? Going to be the companies? Is it going to be audit firms telling them to fix their act? Is it going to be regulators? Probably not, because they don't have any power. Is it going to be Congress? Probably not, because they do have the power, but they're too preoccupied with throwing mud at each other. And meanwhile, we have this huge cybersecurity risk hanging over our heads.
I typically say I can't wait to see what next week brings, but perhaps I should say, I hope we have a little cheerier message next week.
Thank you very much, Tom.